A humiliating encounter unfolds when the arrogant landlord confronts the black family in front of neighbors. His cruel words set the stage for conflict, but the family's quiet strength and a powerful symbolic moment hint that his arrogance will not last forever. We don't want your kind lowering the value of my property. The landlord's voice cracked through the humid summer air, sharp enough to turn heads on the quiet suburban street. The cul-de-sac had been peaceful a moment earlier, children riding bikes, neighbors trimming hedges, dogs barking from behind. White picket fences. But now, every gaze was fixed on the man standing at the front steps of a modest two-story brick house. His chest was puffed, his expensive watch catching the sunlight as he waved a folded paper in the air like a weapon. It wasn't just an eviction notice, it was a public display of ownership, power, and arrogance. Families peeked from porches, whispering behind half-drawn curtains. Some shook their heads in silent disapproval, others leaned in with curiosity, but no one spoke. The silence of the neighborhood made the landlord's cruelty echo even louder. Across from him stood Marcus Johnson, tall and broad-shouldered, his hands steady even as his wife, Alana, clutched the railing behind him. Their two children peeked from the doorway, eyes wide with confusion, their innocence colliding with the sting of humiliation. Marcus didn't answer right away. His silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. His eyes were calm, dark, pools that refused to mirror the rage being hurled at him. The landlord smirked. You people should be grateful you even got to live here this long. Now pack up before I call the sheriff. He unfolded the paper and slapped it against Marcus's chest. The sound was small but carried like a gunshot in the still afternoon air. Alana gasped softly. The neighbors drew back as if even witnessing this moment was dangerous. Marcus took the paper without flinching. His large hand folded it carefully, not as trash but as if storing evidence of the insult. Then he looked up, his voice low but firm. You can take my house, he said, his words slicing through the heavy silence, but you will never own my dignity. The landlord laughed, a harsh sound meant to humiliate, but in that laughter was a tremor, the faintest ripple of unease. Because Marcus hadn't shouted, he hadn't begged. He hadn't looked small, he had looked unbreakable. From the doorway, the children saw their father not crumble, but stand taller than ever. The neighbors saw a man holding his ground with quiet strength. And the landlord, though he would never admit it, felt a flicker of doubt he couldn't quite smother. Keys on my desk by tomorrow, the landlord sneered, turning on his heel. His polished shoes clacked against the concrete as he strode toward his car, but Marcus's last words followed him, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The car door slammed. The engine roared. But as the landlord drove away, his reflection caught in the rearview mirror, he saw Marcus still standing at the steps, his family behind him, and the eviction notice folded in his hand like a battle flag. And in that image was something the landlord didn't want to believe. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The landlord's luxury sedan turned the corner and disappeared, but his words seemed to linger in the warm evening air like smoke that refused to clear. The cul-de-sac, usually filled with the chatter of neighbors and the squeals of children, felt unnaturally heavy. One by one, curtains fell shut. Porch lights flicked on though the sun had not yet set, a subtle way of retreating from what had just happened. The silence was its own kind of violence, an unspoken agreement that this wasn't their fight, but not everyone looked away. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly widow who lived 2 doors down, stood on her porch with her small dog tucked under her arm. Her lips pressed tight, her eyes glassy. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. She turned back into her home, the door clicking shut like the final note in a song no one wanted to hear. Marcus stood still on the porch, shoulders squared, the eviction notice folded neatly in his palm. Behind him, Alana's hand rested against the wooden railing, her knuckles pale from gripping too hard. Daddy, a small voice whispered. He turned. His son, Elijah, stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with questions too big for a boy of 10. Beside him, little Naomi clutched her brother's shirt, her curls framing her tear-streaked face. Why doesn't he want us here? Elijah asked. The question sliced deeper than the landlord's words had. Marcus crouched to meet his children's. gaze, his strong hands resting on their shoulders. He felt Alana's eyes on him, searching for the right answer just as much as the children were. Because some people, Marcus said slowly, carefully, don't see the truth of who we are. They only see what they want to see. But that doesn't make them right, Naomi sniffled. Are we going to lose our home? Alana knelt beside him, pulling both children into her arms. This is more than a house, she whispered into their hair. Wherever we are together, that's home. But Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew her words were true, but he also knew the sting of displacement, the weight of starting over when you shouldn't have to dot as dusk deepened. The Johnson family gathered around the dining table. The eviction notice lay flat in the center, the black ink glaring up at them under the dim light bulb. Alana rubbed her temples. 30 days, that's what he wrote. But knowing him, he'll push to get us out sooner. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. He wants us to break. He wants us to fight with anger so he can paint us as the problem. We won't give him that. Silence stretched. The children had gone upstairs, their footsteps faint overhead. Alana studied her husband, her eyes weary but filled with faith. You sounded so strong out there, but inside, what are you really feeling, Marcus? He exhaled, the kind of sigh that carried years of swallowed pride and unspoken battles. I feel tired of proving we belong, tired of carrying dignity like armor every single day. But I can't let him see that. I can't let our children see that. Her hand slid across the table, resting on his. They saw a man who stood tall today. Don't forget that. Outside, faint whispers still drifted along the street. Two neighbors spoke in hushed tones by a mailbox. A teenager on a bike slowed as he passed the Johnsons' home, his gaze lingering before he sped off. The story of what had happened was already spreading, weaving itself into the fabric of the neighborhood's gossip. Marcus glanced at the window, at the shadows of people who had watched but said nothing. His voice hardened. They'll remember. They might not speak, but they'll remember. And one day, silence won't protect them either. The words hung heavy in the room, prophetic and sharp. In that moment, Alana saw something shift in him. The calm strength that had held him on the porch was still there, but now it carried the faint glimmer of something more dangerous to the arrogant. Landlord, resolve. Marcus wasn't just planning to endure. He was planning to fight quietly, strategically, with the dignity that made arrogance crumble from the inside out. And though the house was filled with the weight of fear, it was also filled with something else. Hope. The landlord, Richard Halston, sipped his brandy in the glow of the country club's chandelier. The amber liquid swirled lazily in his glass, reflecting the smug curl of his lips as he leaned back in his leather chair. Around him, 3 other men in press suits laughed loudly at his story. So you finally did it, Halston? One of them chuckled. Got rid of that family? I'm surprised they lasted this long. Richard smirked, straightening his tie. Took more patience than I'd like to admit. But some people just don't belong in neighborhoods like ours. It lowers the prestige, you know? The men nodded, clinking glasses. The laughter blended with the soft jazz drifting from the lounge speakers. To them, it was just another evening of power and prejudice dressed in expensive suits. But when Richard excused himself and stepped into the empty corridor, the performance slipped. His reflection in the tall mirror stared back. Polished shoes, tailored jacket, expensive watch, but behind the surface, something gnawed at him. He had seen Marcus's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a man broken by defeat. They were steady, defiant, unyielding. That look had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He shook it off, muttering under his breath, "He'll be gone in 30 days. That's all that matters." Yet even as he told himself this, unease pressed against his chest like an unwelcome guest. Meanwhile, back at the Johnsons' home, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice spread open again. A single lamp cast long shadows across. The paper, its bold black letters screaming injustice with every glance. Alana joined him, setting down a steaming mug of tea. "You've read that paper 100 times, she said gently. Marcus rubbed his forehead. "Because every word is meant to strip us down. But he doesn't realize words can't do that. Not to us." Alana sat across from him, her fingers tracing the wood grain of the table. "So what now?" He leaned back, exhaling slowly. We fight, not with fists or shouting. We fight the way they least expect through the system they think they own. Alana raised an eyebrow. The bank? Marcus nodded. Every house has a trail: mortgages, liens, payments. If he thinks he's untouchable, it's because no one's looked close enough. For the first time since the eviction notice, Alana felt a spark of possibility. You think he's hiding something? Marcus's lips curved slightly, not quite. A smile, but close. Men like him always are. The next morning, Richard strutted across the manicured lawn outside the Johnsons' house, smug satisfaction in his stride. He had come not to check on progress, but to make sure his presence was felt. He paused at the sidewalk, glancing at the curtains where curious eyes peeked out. Folding his arms, he called loudly, "Better start packing boxes. 30 days moves fast." Marcus stepped onto the porch, his tall frame cutting a striking figure against the morning sun. His tone was calm, his voice steady. "You've made your point. Now leave my family in peace." Richard smirked. Peace? Peace comes when order is restored. And order means families like yours don't drag this neighborhood down. The words were designed to provoke, but Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he looked Richard directly in the eye. "You see us as weak. But weakness isn't standing here. It's hiding behind paper and arrogance." For a brief moment, Richard's jaw tightened. The neighbors watching from behind their curtains saw the smallest twitch in his composure. Then he laughed, forcing bravado back into his tone. "Enjoy your last month, Johnson. After that, you'll be a memory." He walked off quickly, perhaps too quickly. Marcus remained at the porch, his children watching silently from inside. He didn't need to tell them what they had just witnessed. They could already sense it. The cracks in the landlord's mask had begun to show. The library smelled of dust and polished wood, a quiet sanctuary away from the storm outside. Marcus sat hunched over a stack of public records, his large hands carefully flipping each page. He had always believed knowledge was a weapon quiet, sharp, and far more dangerous than fists. Rows of numbers, mortgage filings, and foreclosure records glared up at him under the flickering lamp. The county's database wasn't easy to navigate, but Marcus had patience. Each document was a clue, and he was determined to follow the trail until it led to something the landlord couldn't hide. Soft voice interrupted his focus. "Still here?" Marcus looked up to see Claire, the young librarian, smiling faintly. She had seen him come often after work, still in his worn construction boots, determination carved into his features. "Yeah," Marcus said, tapping the stack of papers. "Trying to make sense of this mess." Claire lowered her voice. "You're not the first one to look into Richard Halston's name. You might want to check the foreclosure files from 10 years ago. He barely held on to his properties back then." Marcus's brow lifted. "Appreciate that." She gave a quick nod before disappearing down an aisle, her discretion intact. Marcus returned to the pages, and there it was: Halston Properties, nearly defaulted a decade earlier, saved only by a last-minute loan. His empire wasn't built on strength. It was built on fragility and timing. He leaned back in his chair, whispering to himself, "You're not untouchable, Halston, not at all." Back at the Johnsons' home, Alana stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the street. A group of neighbors were gathered at Mrs. Thompson's porch, their voices low but urgent. Every now and then, their eyes flicked toward the Johnson house. When she stepped outside to collect the mail, the conversation faltered. Smiles appeared too quick, too rehearsed. "Evening, Alana," Mrs. Thompson said softly, clutching her shawl. "Evening," Alana replied, her tone polite but edged. She could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing between them. One of the younger women finally spoke. "We heard what happened with the landlord. It wasn't right." Alana tilted her head. "Then why didn't anyone say anything?" The question cut sharper than she intended, but she didn't take it back. Silence fell again. Mrs. Thompson's eyes glistened as she looked at the ground. "People are afraid. He owns half this neighborhood. If we speak, we risk our homes too." Alana's chest tightened. Fear was their chain, silence their cage. She wanted to scream at them, but instead she took a breath and said, "Silence helps him, not us." She turned back toward her home, the weight of disappointment heavy on her shoulders. Yet she also carried something else, the faint realization. That fear meant Halston's control wasn't respect, it was tyranny. That night, Marcus spread the documents across the dining table. Alana leaned over his shoulder, scanning the highlighted lines. "You were right," she whispered. "He's vulnerable." Marcus nodded. "He thinks we'll leave quietly. But if the bank sees these numbers, if they realize he's been stretching..." "His loans." Alana's lips curved into the first real smile in days. "Then the keys he's waving over us might not even belong to him." Marcus looked at her, his expression solemn but resolute. "We're not just fighting for us, Alana. We're fighting for everyone he's silenced." The children padded softly into the room, Elijah clutching a worn notebook. "Daddy," he said timidly, "can I help?" Marcus blinked. "With what?" Elijah opened the notebook, filled with sketches and scribbles. "I can write down everything you find, like evidence, like in the movies." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He ruffled his son's hair, pulling him close. "Then you're part of this fight too, son." Alana gathered Naomi into her lap, holding her close. For the first time since the eviction notice, the family didn't feel like victims waiting for the blow. They felt like warriors, quiet, strategic, bound by dignity. And outside their window, though the street looked calm, the landlord's empire had just felt its first tremor. The sound of engines broke the morning calm. Two black SUVs rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, their tinted windows gleaming in the sunlight. At their head, Richard Halston stepped out, his gold watch catching the light like a weapon. He had come not for conversation, but for spectacle. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains as Richard's men unloaded boxes labeled property management onto the sidewalk. The display was intentional, loud, and humiliating. "Morning, Johnsons." Richard's voice boomed across the street, theatrical in its arrogance. "Thought I'd bring some boxes to help you pack." "No need to thank me." Laughter rippled from the men behind him, though it sounded hollow, forced. Marcus stepped onto the porch, his shoulders broad, his gaze steady. He didn't rush, didn't stumble, didn't show anger. He stood as though the stage Richard had created was his own. "Take them back," Marcus said simply. Richard tilted his head, smirk tugging at his lips. Now. Pride won't help you when the sheriff comes knocking." Alana appeared in the doorway behind Marcus, her arms folded, her eyes sharp as glass. Elijah and Naomi peered from the window, watching silently, their faces pressed against the glass. Richard gestured broadly, speaking loud enough for every hidden neighbor to hear. "Folks, let this be a lesson. Order matters. Respect matters. And if you don't belong," he pointed toward Marcus, "then you don't stay." The words echoed, heavy with venom. But in the silence that followed, Marcus's calm voice cut through like a blade. "You mistake arrogance for respect," Marcus said evenly. "But respect isn't taken with paper or threats. It's earned, and you've never had it." The air shifted. Whispers stirred behind the curtains. A dog barked in the distance. Even the laughter of Richard's men faltered. Richard's smirk cracked for half a second. He turned sharply, snapping at his men to leave the boxes. They obeyed quickly, loading them back into the SUVs, their earlier bravado gone. Richard forced a laugh, loud and sharp. "Enjoy your porch while you can, Johnson. It won't be yours for long." But as he turned back to his car, he felt it, that same quiet defiance that had unsettled him at the start. Marcus wasn't breaking. He wasn't folding. He was standing taller with each attempt to humiliate him. Richard slammed the SUV door harder than necessary. Tires screeched as they pulled away, the sound lingering like the sting of defeat. Inside the Johnson home, the family gathered around the table. The eviction notice still lay there, but now it looked smaller, less threatening. "He's trying harder," Alana whispered. "Because he's afraid," Marcus replied. He spread the bank records across the table again. "Men like him only put on a show when they feel control slipping." Elijah leaned closer, eyes curious. "Did we win?" Marcus smiled faintly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Not yet. But we're closer than he realizes." That evening, whispers drifted down the street like wind. Neighbors who had watched in silence earlier began to murmur. "He's gone too far this time," one voice whispered. "Johnson didn't even flinch," another added. By nightfall, Richard's attempt at humiliation had turned into something else, a story of dignity that spread beyond the cul-de-sac. And in Richard's mansion at the edge of town, as he poured another glass of brandy, his hand trembled slightly. He told himself it was nothing. But in the quiet, his reflection in the glass whispered otherwise. The empire he thought was unshakable had just begun to crack. The next morning, Marcus awoke to the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch. When he opened the door, two uniformed officers stood stiffly with a folder in hand. "Mr. Johnson?" one of them asked. "Yes," Marcus answered, his chest tightening. The officer handed him the folder. Inside was a court summons. Richard had filed an emergency petition to fast-track the eviction. The date was set for only 1 week away. Alana gasped when she read the papers. "He's not giving us time. He's trying to push us out before we can even prepare." Marcus's jaw tightened. He had seen this tactic before. Richard wasn't just a landlord. He was a man who knew how to pull strings, how to bend the system until it snapped against anyone standing in his way. That afternoon, Richard sat smugly in his office at the real estate firm, the skyline behind him glowing in the sun. "Johnson won't know what hit him," Richard told his lawyer, a cold man in a gray suit. "Fast-tracked, stamped, and signed. By this time next week, his family will be out on the street." The lawyer nodded, but his tone was cautious. "You've made this very public. If it backfires..." Richard slammed his fist on the desk. "It won't. People like him don't win. They never win." But beneath his fury, a small seed of unease lingered, one he refused to acknowledge. Back at the Johnson home, Marcus spread the papers across the table, just as he had done with the eviction notice. The children sat quietly, sensing the weight of the moment. "We only have a week," Alana whispered, her hand resting on his. Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we use it." He began making calls. First to a friend at the community center, then to a retired judge he once helped with a veterans program, and finally to a young lawyer named Carmen who had made a name fighting housing discrimination cases. Within hours, his small kitchen table was covered in more than papers. It was covered in possibilities. 2 days later, Carmen arrived at the Johnson home. She was sharp, confident, with fire in her eyes. "I've seen Richard Halston's tactics before," she said, flipping through the documents. "Predatory contracts, forced evictions. But you," she looked directly at Marcus, "you've done something no one else has. You didn't break. And people noticed." Marcus frowned. "People?" Carmen nodded. "I've already had 3 neighbors call me, willing to testify about what they've seen. The intimidation. The threats. He's been sloppy, too sure of himself." For the first time in days, Alana allowed herself a small smile. "So we fight?" Carmen's eyes gleamed. "We don't just fight. We expose him." Meanwhile, Richard drove through the neighborhood that evening, his SUV crawling past the Johnson home like a predator circling prey. He saw the lights on, shadows moving inside. He smirked. "They're scrambling," he muttered to himself. "It won't matter." But what he didn't see were the silhouettes of neighbors gathering 2 houses down, quietly talking, whispering plans. The story of Marcus's calm defiance had spread, and something Richard had never anticipated was forming: unity. That night, Marcus stood by the window, watching the street lamps glow. Elijah walked up beside him, clutching his small toy soldier. "Daddy," the boy asked softly, "are they going to take our house?" Marcus knelt, meeting his son's wide eyes. "They're going to try, but we're not alone. Do you understand?" Elijah nodded slowly, his little hand gripping Marcus's. "No matter what happens," Marcus whispered, "we stand." Far across town, in his high-rise office, Richard raised his glass of brandy again. But this time, the reflection that stared back at him was restless. His trap was set, yes, but something about Marcus's silence, his refusal to bow, made Richard uneasy in ways he couldn't explain. And for the first time, Richard wondered not whether Marcus would fall, but whether his empire could withstand what was coming. The courthouse loomed tall against the pale morning sky. Marcus stood on the steps, his hands buried in his coat pockets, feeling the cold bite through the fabric. Alana adjusted her scarf, then touched his arm gently. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered. He nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the heavy wooden doors ahead. "I know, that's why I'm here." Behind them, Carmen strode confidently with her briefcase, her heels clicking against the stone. She looked every bit the fighter Marcus needed, sharp, unshaken, and ready to strike. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his polished black SUV across the street, watching. His lawyer was beside him, going over paperwork. "This will be quick," Richard said, sipping his coffee. "Judges love landlords. Tenants like Johnson are disposable." The lawyer gave a thin smile. "It does look favorable, but no buts," Richard snapped. "By noon, he'll be nothing but a memory in that house." But as he stepped out of the car, a sound drifted across the courthouse lawn. Voices dotted. First, it was only a handful, neighbors holding small signs, quiet but firm. But within minutes, more arrived. People from Marcus's church, parents from the school where Alana volunteered, even an elderly woman Richard himself had once threatened with eviction. "Justice for Johnson." A voice cried. Richard froze. The chant caught like wildfire. Soon the courthouse steps trembled with the sound of dozens of voices rising together. "Justice for Johnson! Justice for Johnson!" For the first time, Richard's confident stride faltered. He turned to his lawyer. "What is this?" The lawyer's face was pale. "Public support and media." He nodded toward the corner where two reporters were setting up cameras. Richard's stomach twisted. Inside, Marcus sat quietly at the long oak table as Carmen prepared her notes. She leaned in close. "This is bigger than just you now. The community is watching." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Then I can't fail." "You won't," she assured him. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge entered, a stern man with a silver beard. Richard smirked as he took his place, convinced the outcome was already in his favor. Richard's lawyer was first to speak. He presented the eviction papers, citing unpaid fees and community disturbances. He painted Marcus as a man unfit to live in such a respectable neighborhood. When he finished, Richard leaned back smug. Then Carmen rose. Her presence filled the room. "Your Honor," she began firmly, "this is not just an eviction. This is an attack. My client has paid every rent bill. We have proof. The landlord's claims are not only false, they are malicious, rooted in intimidation and discrimination." She set down a stack of documents with a sharp thud. "And we have witnesses." The first witness was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman Richard once tried to force out. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "He came to my door at night," she said, pointing at Richard. "Told me I didn't belong. Told me people like me were lowering the value of his property." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Next came a neighbor, then a school teacher, then even a delivery driver, all telling stories of threats, pressure, and fear. Each word was another crack in Richard's armor. Outside, the chants grew louder, echoing through the courthouse walls. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras flashed. Richard shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming at his temple. He whispered harshly to his lawyer, "Shut this down." But his lawyer only shook his head. "They've built a case, Richard. A strong one." When Marcus was finally called to the stand, the room fell silent. He adjusted the microphone, his deep voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I'm not here because I wanted to fight," he began. "I'm here because a man tried to take from me what little my family has. Not because I broke the law, not because I failed my duties, but because of the color of my skin." He paused, glancing toward Alana, then to the rows of people watching. "But we are not weak. We are not invisible. We belong. And no amount of threats will change that." The room erupted in applause before the judge banged his gavel for order. Richard's face burned with rage. For the first time in his career, he realized control was slipping from his hands. As the session adjourned for the day, Carmen whispered to Marcus, "We made a dent. Tomorrow we drive it home." Marcus exhaled deeply, looking out at the sea of supporters waiting outside, and in that moment, he understood. This was no longer just about saving his home. It was about saving the dignity of everyone Richard had tried to break, and this fight had only just begun. The second day in court dawned with heavy clouds hanging low in the sky. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, lacing his shoes slowly. Alana poured him coffee, her hands trembling. "You'll win," she whispered. "I can feel it." Marcus gave a faint smile. "I just hope the judge feels it too." Carmen knocked at the door right on time, briefcase in hand. She didn't waste words, just looked Marcus in the eye and said, "Today, we press harder." At the courthouse, Richard strode through the crowd of protesters, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with contempt. The chants were louder than the day before. "Justice for Johnson! Justice for Johnson!" He muttered to his lawyer, "This is a circus. Why hasn't someone cleared them out?" His lawyer shook his head. "They have the right to be here. And the press is eating it up. The more you react, the worse you'll." "Look," Richard snarled. "I don't care how I look. I care about winning." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The judge entered, calling the session to order. Richard's lawyer wasted no time. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "testimonies yesterday were emotional, yes, but irrelevant. None of them proved discrimination in this specific case. My client has only acted to enforce legal property agreements." Richard smirked, adjusting his tie. Carmen rose slowly. "Your Honor, we intend to show that Mr. Hensley's actions are part of a pattern. This isn't just about a contract. It's about a landlord using fear and prejudice to push people out of their homes." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Carmen called her first witness, a young man in a delivery uniform. "Tell us what happened the day you saw my client confronted by Mr. Hensley." The man cleared his throat nervously. "I was dropping off packages when I saw Mr. Johnson standing outside with his daughter. Mr. Hensley was yelling. I heard him say—" The witness hesitated, glancing at Richard. Carmen leaned closer. "You're under oath. Please tell the court." He said, "People like you ruin neighborhoods." "You'll be out soon enough." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Richard's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Objection! Hearsay!" The judge shook his head. "Overruled." The witness heard it directly. "Continue." Richard's smirk flickered. Next, Carmen introduced the rent receipts. Every payment Marcus had ever made, all on time. She laid them out like a trail of evidence, each piece cutting deeper into Richard's story. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "this man is not an irresponsible tenant. He is a victim of intimidation." Richard shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, his arrogance wavered, but Richard wasn't about to surrender. When it was his turn to testify, he walked to the stand with forced confidence. "Mr. Hensley," his lawyer began, "do you discriminate against your tenants?" "Absolutely not," Richard said smoothly. "I treat everyone equally. Mr. Johnson simply failed to meet community standards. His family is loud, disruptive, and—" "Objection!" Carmen shot up. "Personal attacks, not facts." "Sustained," the judge warned. Richard clenched his jaw, then continued more carefully. "I only acted in the best interest of the property." Now it was Carmen's turn. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on Richard. Mr. Hensley. She began, her voice razor sharp. "How many tenants of color live in your properties?" Richard hesitated. "I don't keep track." "Really?" Carmen raised an eyebrow. "Yet you filed eviction notices against 4 tenants in the last year, all of whom happened to be black or Hispanic. Coincidence?" Richard flushed red. "They broke rules. Every one of them." "Rules are your prejudice." Carmen pressed. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Richard shifted in his seat, sweat beading at his temple. Carmen stepped closer. "Do you deny calling Mrs. Henderson?" She pointed to the elderly woman in the gallery, a burden, and telling her she didn't belong. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Answer the question, Mr. Hensley." "I may have been harsh," Richard muttered, "but that's business." "Business?" Carmen's voice cracked like a whip. "Or bigotry?" The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the scribbling of reporters' pens. When the session paused for recess, Marcus stepped outside into the crowd of supporters. They cheered as he appeared, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand. "You're not alone, brother," someone shouted. Alana squeezed his hand tightly. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't from fear, they were from pride. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt taller, stronger. Across the courtyard, Richard lit a cigarette with trembling hands. His lawyer tried to calm him. "You're losing ground. Her questioning is cutting deep." Richard blew out smoke angrily. "She's twisting everything. I just have to hold on until the judge rules." But deep inside, doubt gnawed at him. For years he had ruled his tenants through intimidation, never challenged. Now in front of the entire city, his mask was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the crowd chanted louder outside and the press prepared their evening broadcasts, Marcus realized this battle wasn't just about four walls and a roof anymore. It was about truth, about dignity, about finally standing up to a man who had crushed others in silence. And tomorrow, the fight would reach its peak. The air in the courtroom the next morning was heavy, so heavy that every cough, every whisper echoed like thunder. The benches were packed with reporters, neighbors, activists, and ordinary citizens who had heard about the case. Judge Whitman entered, his face unreadable as always, but his eyes lingered on Richard just a fraction longer than the day before. Marcus sat beside Carmen, his hands clenched tightly on his knees. He whispered, "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Carmen leaned close. "One more push, Marcus. Today we strike." Richard's lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, we maintain that my client's actions were strictly professional. The witnesses' statements are biased, exaggerated, or taken out of context. We ask the court to dismiss these claims of discrimination." Richard straightened, a smug smile tugging at his lips, but Carmen rose slowly, walking to the center of the room like a seasoned performer preparing for her final act. "With the court's permission," she said, "I'd like to introduce a new piece of evidence." Gasps rippled across the room. Even Richard's lawyer looked blindsided. Carmen pulled a small recorder from her briefcase. "This device was given to me yesterday by a former employee of Mr. Hensley. She was too afraid to come forward herself, but what she left behind speaks for itself." Richard shot up in outrage. "This is outrageous. Hearsay. Manufactured. Sit down, Mr. Hensley," the judge snapped. "We'll hear the evidence." Carmen pressed play. Static crackled, followed by Richard's unmistakable voice, dripping with contempt. "I don't care if they pay on time. People like them drag property value down. The sooner they're out, the better. I'll make their lives hell until they leave." The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, cries of shame. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. His hands trembled as he stared at Richard, who had gone pale as paper. The judge banged his gavel furiously. "Order! Order in this court!" Carmen let the words linger before clicking the device off. "Your Honor," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "this is not business. This is not a misunderstanding. This is hate, plain and simple." Richard's lawyer scrambled, sweating bullets. "There's no proof this recording is authentic," Carmen cut him off. "The timestamp, the location data, the voice print analysis, it's all verified. And we are prepared to submit it officially into evidence." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He studied Richard for a long, heavy moment. "Mr. Hensley," he said slowly, "do you deny this is your voice?" Richard swallowed hard. I was taken out of context. Answer." "The question," the judge pressed. Richard's voice cracked. "It sounds like me, yes." The courtroom gasped again. Marcus felt a rush of emotion, anger, relief, vindication, all tangled together. For weeks he had been painted as the troublemaker, the liar, the one who didn't belong. And now, finally, the truth stood naked before everyone. Carmen didn't let up. "Mr. Hensley, you told this court you treat all tenants equally. Were those your words on the tape?" Richard's face glistened with sweat. "I was frustrated, that's all. People take things the wrong way." "Frustrated enough," Carmen said coldly, "to deliberately drive families out of their homes because of the color of their skin?" Richard's mouth opened and closed, like a man drowning. No answer came. The gallery was alive with whispers, outrage, and a kind of electric hope. Alana squeezed Marcus's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks. Reporters scribbled furiously, already imagining the morning headlines. Landlord exposed. Racist recording shocks court. Richard buried his face in his hands, his arrogance crumbling into despair. 4. The first time, he looked small. When the session adjourned for a short recess, Marcus stepped outside. The crowd outside had doubled overnight, chanting louder than ever, "Justice for Johnson," and "Racist evictions." When they saw Marcus, the chants grew deafening. He lifted a hand, humbled by their support. For once he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, heard, respected. Back inside, Richard sat slumped at the defense table, his lawyer whispering frantically. "You should settle," the lawyer hissed. "This tape destroyed us." "No." Richard snapped. "I won't let that man win. I won't." His outburst was so loud that even the judge raised an eyebrow. Richard was unraveling, and everyone knew it. As court resumed, Judge Whitman addressed the room. His tone was heavy with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements. But I will say this, what I've heard today is deeply troubling. This court does not tolerate deceit or prejudice, no matter how it is dressed up as business." He looked squarely at Richard. "Mr. Hensley, you would do well to prepare yourself." The gavel struck. Court adjourned. Marcus stood still for a moment, absorbing the judge's words. Carmen placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're almost there," she said softly. "Tomorrow justice speaks." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Richard, who sat broken, his empire of intimidation crumbling around him. For the first time, Marcus truly believed that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. And tomorrow, the world would hear the final verdict. The final day of the trial dawned with a sky painted in soft gold, as though even nature knew something monumental was about to happen. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled larger than ever before. Activists held banners, neighbors waved signs, reporters swarmed the steps with microphones raised. "Justice for Johnson. No more hate. Truth always wins." The chants thundered like waves crashing against stone. Inside, the air was tense and electric. Marcus sat between Alana and Carmen, his heart hammering. He stared straight ahead at Judge Whitman, refusing to even glance at Richard. Richard sat slouched at the defense table, a shadow of his former self. His arrogance was gone, replaced with the hollow eyes of a man cornered by his own lies. His lawyer seemed defeated, shuffling papers without conviction. The judge's gavel struck. "This court will now hear closing statements." Richard's lawyer stood, his voice flat. "Your Honor, despite the allegations and the recording presented, we urge the court to remember my client's decades of service as a landlord. He has housed countless families. Any words spoken in anger were merely frustrations, not policies. We ask the court to show leniency." He sat quickly, as though he couldn't wait to be finished. Then Carmen rose. Every eye followed her as she walked with deliberate calm to the center of the room. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady yet burning with conviction, "this case is not about frustration. It is not about business disputes. It is about the dignity of a man who was targeted, bullied, and humiliated because of the color of his skin. It is about a family pushed to the brink and a community that has watched in silence for far too long." She paused, scanning the room. People leaned forward, hanging on every word. We all heard the recording. We all saw the pattern of evictions, the selective targeting, the harassment. This is not coincidence. This is racism, clear and deliberate. And today, we have the chance to say, no more. Not here, not now, not ever again. Her voice swelled with passion. Marcus Johnson did not ask for special treatment. He asked for fairness. He asked for respect. He asked for what every citizen of this country deserves, equal protection under the law. Carmen's eyes flicked toward Marcus. And today, we demand that he receive it. She stepped back, her words echoing. In the silence, Judge Whitman removed his glasses and polished them slowly, his face unreadable. Then he cleared his throat. This court has considered all evidence presented. We have heard testimony, seen documents, and most damningly, listened to the defendant's own words. Richard squirmed, sweat dripping down his temples. Truth is clear, the judge continued. Mr. Richard Hensley engaged in discriminatory practices against tenants based solely on their race. His actions were cruel, unlawful, and unbecoming of any citizen, let alone one entrusted with the responsibility of providing homes. The gallery held its breath. Therefore, this court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Marcus Johnson. The courtroom erupted cheers, tears, applause echoing like thunder. Marcus felt Alana throw her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. Carmen gripped his hand tightly, her smile fierce with triumph. Judge Whitman wasn't done. He raised his gavel again, silencing the room. As for Mr. Hensley, the court orders immediate restitution to Mr. Johnson and his family for emotional and financial damages. Furthermore, Mr. Hensley is stripped of his license to manage properties in this county. He will face additional civil penalties to be determined in subsequent hearings. Richard's jaw dropped. You can't do this to me. This is my life. My empire. The judge's eyes were steel. You did this to yourself. The gavel came down with finality. Court adjourned. The moment was surreal. Marcus sat frozen, his breath shallow, until the reality sank in. He had won. He had stood against the storm and he had won. The crowd outside roared as he stepped into the sunlight, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him. Marcus, how do you feel? What does this verdict mean for your community? He raised his hand for silence. His voice shook with emotion, but it carried strength. This verdict isn't just for me, Marcus said. It's for every family who has ever been told they don't belong. It's for every voice silenced by fear. Today proves that the truth can be buried, but it will always rise again. And hate will always, always fall. The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound rolling down the courthouse steps like a wave of justice. Later, in the quiet of their living room, Marcus sat with Alana and Carmen. The kids peeked out from the hallway, their eyes wide with pride. Alana whispered, "You did it. You showed them who you really are." Marcus smiled softly, pulling his children close. "No," he said, voice trembling with gratitude. "We did it. Together." Carmen raised her glass of water. "To truth," she said. Marcus lifted his in return. "To justice." They clinked glasses, the sound small but powerful like the first note of a new beginning. As night fell, Marcus stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker. The world outside was still imperfect, still scarred by prejudice. But for the first time in a long time, he believed change was possible, because today hate had been dragged into the light and the light had won. And tomorrow, he knew that light would shine even brighter.